There was a profound ambivalence among white atheists and free thinkers about the question of the West's racial and civilizational superiority. On the one hand, they imagined themselves at the pinnacle of the racial and civilization hierarchy. But on the other, the vast majority of their countrymen were Christians who seemed to reject the West's greatest gifts, namely reason and science, which led them to question these same notions of racial and cultural superiority. While white atheists never quite succeeded in resolving this tension, their efforts reveal nuanced and often novel attempts to grapple with the problems of race and civilization. That quote comes from a new book by Nathan G. Alexander entitled Race and a Godless World, Atheism, Race, and Civilization, 1850 to 1914, published in 2019 by Manchester University Press and New York University Press. My name is James Ungrianu, and welcome again to Confronting History, a George L. Mossey program in history webinar. George L. Mossey, a great historian, teacher, mentor, and friend, taught at the UW-Madison campus for 40 years and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem for 20 years. The mission of the Mossey program, which he endowed, is to support and sustain international scholarship and provide opportunities for a new generation of scholars to experience that community through graduate and postdoctoral work, faculty exchange, graduate fellowships, scholarly publications, conferences, online courses, a digital archive project, museum exhibits, and much more. This webinar series, Confronting History, which borrows its title from Mossey's own memoir, is designed to maintain engagement and momentum in the network given the limited current opportunities for face-to-face activities. In this series, we talk to scholars from a range of disciplines, discussing all things at the intersections of European and American history, culture, sexuality, and ideas. Our guest today is Dr. Nathan Alexander. Welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Right. So I'm from Canada originally. That's where I am currently. Let's see. I did my BA and MA in history in Canada. Then I moved on to teach English in South Korea for a couple of years, and then I did my PhD in Scotland at the University of St. Andrews with Colin Kidd, and that's where I wrote the dissertation that would eventually become my book. In terms of my religious background, which might be relevant just for my own book, I was raised Anglican, and then gradually sort of came to give that up, and maybe around when I was about 20 or so, early 20s, became an atheist, and that's somewhat influenced the topic I chose, I guess, for my PhD, because that was around the time that I was beginning my PhD as well.
Okay, I mean, I kind of took the same route. After I finished my MA, I decided to go to South Korea as well.
Oh,
And
wow. All right.
I taught English there for a year, I think from
Wow.
2012 to 2013. So
Wow.
I was located in the countryside. I picked
Okay.
Yonghae, which is kind of a small village, maybe 3 hours south of Seoul. So
Right.
it
Okay.
was really out there in the countryside. So we were actually the only native English speakers in our area. Where did you teach?
I was in Seoul. We overlapped a bit because I was there in 2011 to 2013.
So back to your work as a scholar here. So what do you research? What do you typically research?
Yeah. My two main areas are the history of race and racism, and I guess imperialism and things like this, and the history of atheism and secularization and religious doubt. And so I should also say, particularly in Britain and the United States, and particularly in the 19th century, although that sort of expands to maybe the 18th century into the 20th century, and other countries as well, I guess, insofar as they're relevant, I suppose. Yeah.
Speaking about your book, here it is. It's Race in a Godless World, Atheism, Race, and Civilization, 1850 to 1914. By the way, why that specific date range, 1850 to 1914?
Well, I think like the actual dates themselves are not necessarily important. I mean, 1850 just because it's the middle of the century, 1914 is the start of the First World War.
Okay.
And I think, there's some wiggle room, I suppose, on either side of
Yeah.
those dates. But I think there are two main reasons for focusing on that sort of rough time frame. And I think both regarding race and the atheism. So on the race angle, I think around the second half of the 19th century,
Okay.
there's a number of trends, I suppose, where race is seen in increasingly like biological, scientific terms. And I
Yeah.
think probably the impact of Darwin's book, which comes Origin of the Species, which comes out in 1859.
Yeah.
I think that's important. And also imperialism kind of reaches a high point, I suppose, at the end of the 19th century, and it's all intertwined with these biological theories of race. So I think that's one reason for focusing on the second half of the 19th century.
Okay.
Then the other is the atheism angle, and again, I think that sort of organized atheist movement again sort of reaches a high point at the end of the second half of the 19th century. Before then we don't see, I mean, I think it obviously starts before 1850, but into beyond 1850, you start to see more and more organizations with greater membership and having a greater impact in the wider society. So I think those two reasons were why I kind of chose those dates. Although, yeah, I mean, they are kind of fuzzy on both sides, really.
So why two publishers? You got New York Press and then Manchester Press. What's the story behind that?
I mean, it's really just that it was somewhat, again, by accident, a happy accident that I.
Are they the same book in Manchester Press and then?
No, they're the same. Yeah.
Okay.
It was just that I had approached both at different times, and basically I was thinking I was gonna have to choose between the two publishers, and then I think someone from NYU Press suggested maybe we could just do like a co-publication, and the people from Manchester agreed to that. So I mean, yeah, like obviously it was good for me because I didn't have to choose between them.
Yeah, that doesn't happen often, so it's great.
No, I mean, it was quite like I say, like a happy accident that we wound up doing it that way, and I think it definitely worked out the best to have a publisher in the US and the UK.
Yeah. So in your book, you begin with this really fascinating juxtaposition. You highlight on the one hand how some scholars have argued that secularization contributed to the development of racism or racist ideas. But on the other scholars have argued that Christianity in particular played a sort of a crucial role in the emergence of racist beliefs. Now, why is there this conflict in the scholarship? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, in my sort of introduction, I do lay out like these two sort of competing ideas, I suppose. So on the one hand, there's an argument that you see, or that one sees in the scholarship around the idea of race, that say in the 18th century and in the 19th century, like as religious authority kind of falls away or begins to fall away, this opens the door to thinking about humanity in different ways. So not thinking of humanity as, a creation of God, or humanity as all being ancestors of Adam and Eve, but as just sort of natural, no different than in any other animal, really. So thinking of humans this way, and when you do this, then well, this is the argument. This isn't necessarily my view, but when you do this, then it's easier to see, just to see humans as able to be divided into different races, and that may be superior or inferior to each other in some ways, and then to treat them differently, not to necessarily treat them as all kind of created in God's image, but just as a kind of animal. So that's the kind of, and then the argument continues by talking about Darwin and how this further erodes sort of theological views of humanity and so on, that might have provided a check to racism. So that's the argument for why secularization might have contributed to racism. So the opposite argument, though, is that Christianity was the one who contributed to racism. And again, the argument is to say, for example, that the long legacy of anti-Semitism in Christianity contributed to racism, and particularly eventually anti-Semitism kind of becomes biologized, I suppose, that it's not just a matter of like a difference of religion, but a difference of race or essence that can't just be changed by converting. And some scholarship seems to say that this happens in early modern Spain after Spain is kind of reconquered by Christians, and there's this drive to convert Jews and Muslims, and there was a concern that the conversions were sort of in name only, and that there was some kind of essence of Jews or Muslims that remained. That is sort of a biological essence. And then the argument is, that eventually by the 19th century, this is like completely a biological category of Jews as a separate race, not just a separate religion, but a separate race as well. So that's one kind of argument against or why Christianity might have contributed to racism. There's also arguments about how it with regard to slavery, for example, in the Americas, that eventually it used to be the case that slaves who could convert, and then they would be able to be freed because it wasn't justified to keep Christians as slaves. But the argument eventually goes, I think in the 18th century or the 17th century, that gradually, again, there's this biological notion of race, that these African people are slaves, sort of permanent slaves, and that even if they convert to Christianity, this doesn't say anything about their condition of slavery. And there's sort of this, one author calls it like hereditary heathenism. So even if there's some essence to being a heathen, quote unquote, that can't just, it's just like a biological essence that can't be erased by converting. And again, like you see arguments that Christianity drives imperialism and drives in the North America, like westward expansion, because there's a need to spread the gospel and so on to so-called heathen peoples and so on. So anyway, so there's these two competing arguments in the scholarship, and I think I don't think there's one that's like necessarily true and one that's necessarily wrong. I think there's some truth in both of those cases, and I think the way my scholarship kind of fits in is that none of those theories really look at what atheists or non-religious people thought about race. So I think that's how my book sort of slots into the debate.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like you, I've seen those arguments from both
Mm,
sides, and they typically kind of ignore each other,
yes.
unfortunately. So
Yeah.
there's a kind of a lack of nuance that you actually bring to your book. I mean, there's a nuance there in your book, and I was really impressed with how you played that kind of back and forth in the introduction. Um, but going back to what you were saying earlier about this popular atheist movement
Mm,
emerging at the end of the 19th century, tell us how that sort of started.
mm,
For example, did advances in the natural sciences contribute to that
mm,
rise? And moreover, can we say that this movement at the end of the 19th century is the sort of the origins of
mm,
contemporary atheist groups,
mm,
like obviously people like Richard Dawkins and
right.
Sam Harris? Are they part of that movement, or are they something completely separate from that earlier 19th
Mm,
century movement?
yeah. Right. So I think the movement has its origins. I think it's more about politics than science. I think that it has its origins in political radicalism around the turn of the, well, like the late 18th century, early 19th century. I think it's because um, in Britain anyway, and like in France, like in the Revolution, for example, that the sort of foundations of power, I suppose, in the society were so tied up. The political power was so tied up with religious power, with like the state church and so on in France, like the Catholic Church,
Mhm.
that be, being like a sort of political radical made you almost by definition like a religious radical as well, or sort of irreligious radical. And so I think that kind of radicalism, it seems like someone like Thomas Paine, who was obviously a political radical opposed to um, to the monarchy and things like this, and a supporter of the American Revolution and the supporter of the French Revolution. Um, that kind of political radicalism and religious uh, contrarianism, I suppose, or
Mm.
skepticism. Like I think it's the political radicalism that's sort of leading the way. Um, and so as you go further into the 19th century, you do see more organized groups that again they're political activist groups, but they also have this anti-religious sentiment. I think it's opposing the authority of religious people and authority of priests and so on.
Mm. Mhm.
Um, I think science. I'm not sure really. Like I think maybe a sort of a impression people might have about the 19th century is that uh, advances in science really do drive the way in unbelief and atheism. But I don't know necessarily that that's the case. I mean, I think it's true that these atheists and so on used arguments in science about, say, about the age of the Earth,
Mhm.
like arguments in geology that showed that the Earth was much older than commonly thought, or that arguments by Darwin that showed that humans or all animals, evolved through natural means rather than being special creations of God.
Mhm.
So I think atheists and other non-religious people use these arguments, but I don't know that this was necessarily in itself kind of a driver of atheism. Um,
So
I don't know. Yeah,
how do you think that compares to the new atheists today?
yeah.
Are they activists and political in the same way, or
Mm,
would you say they are more intellectual than
yeah.
the 19th century variety?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's true that they come out of the same movement. Like I think there's not a clear break between the 19th century. movements and up till today, like many organizations, for example, in Britain, the National Secular Society, which is still around, was formed in the middle of the 19th century. And many, even I think, humanist groups and things like that, if you trace their origins back, they might have different names, but they do kind of come to they do, I think, have their origins in the 19th century or early 20th century. So I think that there is this continuity between the 19th century and the present with regard to sort of organized atheism or organized non-religious, organized non-religion. But I do think, yeah, I mean, that is a good point. Like the political goals, I suppose, are different for Richard Dawkins, I suppose, and Sam Harris. And let me think why. I mean, yeah.
Personally, I've always found it like atheist groups a reflection of who they're arguing against. You look at the atheist groups at the end of the 19th century, and in my opinion, they tend to be a little bit more on the sophisticated side because they were dealing with a religion that was a little bit more sophisticated than the fundamentalism that Dawkins and Sam Harris are attacking or responding to. Would you say that's a fair assessment, that it's a reflection of the particular religious tradition at that particular moment that's kind of inspiring what the atheists are doing?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that partly explains the kind of the emergence of the new atheists around like the early 21st century, I suppose, that there are particular concerns about sort of religious Christian fundamentalists being in power in the US, for example.
But also, they're responding to Islam as well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Islamic extremism. I mean, Sam Harris is really known for being quite antagonistic towards Islam.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's right. And I think it may also be in some ways why new atheism has kind of petered out a little bit in the past couple of years, that the influence of Islamic fundamentalism has seemed to maybe become less of an urgent or less pressing threat, I suppose. And the same with, I mean, obviously with Trump and all that, I mean, it's like evangelicalism is still very tied up with power, but with political power. But I think it's like, it's a different kind of, it's almost like a less genuine version of or more cynical and more just using these religious ideas just as a kind of a symbol of masculinity or white supremacy or whatever. It's more of a code for something rather than being about religion itself.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think yeah, I definitely think it's helpful to think about the kind of atheism we see in history and like what it's responding to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So going back further, you mentioned this, and I believe in your introduction, the sort of the paradox of Enlightenment thought. And what do you mean by that phrase, the paradox of Enlightenment thought? What is the paradox?
I think the paradox is that on the one hand, you have thinkers who are arguing for universal rights and universal freedoms and so on. And then on the other hand, you have these very same figures sometimes writing about how certain races are inferior and maybe are not deserving of these rights. Or the example I used in the introduction is Thomas Jefferson, who obviously wrote very eloquently about universal rights and rights being self-evident and so on. And at the same time, he held slaves and fathered children with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. Yeah, I mean, I think it is a paradox. I think that that there are these competing views, and often within the very same person who who's making these sort of contradictory arguments. And I think it's kind of a paradox, I think, that it sort of continues up into the 19th century or maybe beyond as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in your book, you use some terms that our audience probably need help with some definitions. You spent some time on what is called monogenesis and polygenesis. Can you explain what those terms mean for our listeners?
Yes. So monogenesis is the idea that all humans come from a single origin. So this is where you get the monogenesis. So the idea is that all humans, in this particular case, all humans come from Adam and Eve. So that's the single origin. So everyone, in theory, traces their ancestry back to Adam and Eve. So this is sort of the Christian view, I suppose, in the 19th century. The problem, I guess, that people begin to realize, even I suppose when Europeans arrive in the New World, is that the people seem very, Europeans begin to encounter people of different races, and they begin to realize that, or they're trying to make sense of why people look different. And one idea is maybe it's the climate, maybe people living in different climates, that's why they look different. Like, maybe it's warmer or there's more sunlight or something. But then after Europeans begin to settle in these places for long periods of time, they realize like, our skin color isn't changing or anything. So it's not clear, why, how these other races might have come to be. And so this is where you get this idea of polygenesis. So this is multiple origins, so polygenesis. And so the idea here is that each race has its own separate origin. They're not, all races aren't united by a common ancestor, but they have sort of, separate origins. And the reason that's sort of compelling is because, like I said, that Europeans were beginning to realize, like, say we've been settled in say the Americas for a few hundred years, but white people, like, we're not really changing our skin color or something like that. And the problem is because in this sort of traditional biblical chronology, the world was only like 6,000 years old. So if there was going to be a change, like, it needs to be happening fairly quickly to make sense. Like, for races to kind of differentiate, it needs to happen within this span of 6,000 years. Otherwise, it doesn't seem possible that they could have all had an origin in Adam and Eve. So this is why, polygenesis
Okay.
seems plausible, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a shock for them, the discovery of the New World, because they were discovering people groups that were not accounted for in the biblical narrative, right? So it posed something like a theological crisis, right?
Yeah.
But you argue in your book that polygenesis was ultimately short-sighted. Why? Why is that?
Well, I mean, for many reasons, I guess, but I mean, obviously it fails on multiple reasons. I think I think Darwinism probably is the death, whatever the final nail in the coffin, or whatever the expression is,
Right.
for polygenesis. And I think that's also because, like, geologists and so on were beginning to understand that the world is much older than 6,000 years. So that gives a lot more time for people to begin to look different over many thousands and thousands of years, which wasn't really possible with a shorter chronology of the Earth. So I think there were sort of Christian monogenists who did sort of show that people were changing or were kind of pointing to ways in which, people might have changed over time. But obviously they were hampered by this shorter chronology. So once the chronology is pushed back further, this gives more time. And Darwin's ideas give, well, even beyond just saying how people could differentiate, Darwin's ideas told us how species could differentiate over, millions and millions and billions, I guess, of years. So I think Darwinism kind of deals a final blow to polygenesis.
Hmm. We'll talk about Darwin in a minute here, but this is where I want to still focus on like the pre-Darwinian ideas of human origins and how did these like monogenesis and polygenesis, how did these ideas, these theories of human origins play a role in the rise of racism or racist ideas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess one of the things is that polygenesis is almost, it's like inherently racist, because it's saying that different races are permanently separate, and it also has the implication of being very concerned about so-called miscegenation, which is one race, like people from different races coupling up and having children, because if they're, if they are kind of fundamentally different groups, then this is going to result in very bad outcomes. I suppose the argument is from polygenesis that if people of different races have children, this is going to lead to polygenesis made the argument that this would result in infertile children, for example, like when you see other sort of closely related species having offspring, that's the result of like an infertile offspring. So they said like, children of say mixed race couples like are going to result in infertile, or maybe like the health will be very poor. So I think there's like this racist view about interracial relationships or whatever, and I think that has a really long history. I mean, even beyond what people thought of as polygenesis, like this sort of concern about racial mixing. I think that's one kind of legacy of polygenesis. I mean, I suppose, and then like in some ways, monogenesis worked against that racist view by saying, that actually all all people are related to Adam and Eve. They're all created by God. They're all equal, at least in theory. But then even in a case like that, so I mentioned in my book, like there's these two cases of one polygenist in the US named Josiah Nott, who was a slave owner and supported slavery naturally. And there's also a monogenist. He was trying to think of what his particular denomination is, a clergyman called John Bachman, and he was a monogenist, but he also supported slavery. Although, I mean, it was so Josiah Nott and John Bachman, like they disagreed completely about this issue of monogenesis versus polygenesis, but they were totally in agreement about the legitimacy of slavery. Right. I think it's that complexity that there's sort of multiple ways to get at racist ends, I suppose, even with contradictory theories.
Yeah, and to make it even more complex is that the polygenicists they believed they were using the latest scientific evidence to support their position, their racist viewpoint. but they also had theological implications as well. They had an agenda against Christianity. Can you unpack that first? How does polygenesis, besides the obvious, this is we're coming from more than just Adam and Eve. How did the polygenicists use this viewpoint to argue not just against racism but against Christianity as well?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question because it actually I sort of feel like for polygenists, almost their main goal wasn't racism. It was almost a sort of theological criticism, and that's why you see atheists interested in ideas of polygenesis. So the main example I have, or one of the big examples I have in my book, is Charles Bradlaugh, who was a probably probably one of the most important atheists in Britain in the 19th century. He went on to he founded the National Secular Society, and he was the first atheist member of Parliament. But anyway, he was very interested in this idea of polygenesis because he saw that if his argument was if all humans don't come from Adam and Eve, this this sort of presents a problem for all of the entire Christian story, because the idea is that original sin is transmitted by Adam to all humans, and then in turn that Jesus, um, his death and resurrection is all meant to kind of atone for that original sin. So if everyone is not coming from Adam, this means that Jesus's salvation is only kind of granted to a particular segment of the population, and that means the Christian and therefore Christianity isn't a universal thing, and the whole story kind of collapses if um, if everyone is not descending from Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
So that's why and it's kind of it's sort of strange, I suppose. I mean, because you see that Bradlaugh is drawing on these racist arguments to make what is really like a theological case. Like he's not trying to defend racism per se, although he's using it to make a theological argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You also talk about the origins of the American School of Anthropology, but
Mm.
also the London Anthropological Society as well. And you make the connection between this kind of racist mentality or racist views and the foundation of anthropology. Can you say a little bit
Mm.
more about that?
Yeah, I think in the case of the London School of Anthropology, or Anthropological Society, I should say, it's yeah, I think it was sort of a offshoot of this ethnological society, and they were desiring to have a forum for talking about polygenesis because the ethnological society was very Christian, sort of Christian based, and they promoted monogenesis,
And that's
and so
interesting.
and
Was
so
was it
um,
because it was full of missionaries, or what was
um,
the origins of that group?
uh, I think it actually came out of the Aborigines Protection Society, which itself is somewhat kind of uh, based, and that which in itself came out of the abolitionist movement. Um, so which is again like very tied up with Christianity. So I think there was a lot of I think sort of missionaries and humanitarians that were involved in those societies. Um, so anyway, the London the Anthropological Society of London kind of wanted a forum kind of separate from the Ethnological Society to talk about polygenesis, and also to it was quite a like a heterodoxical movement that was proudly kind of contrarian, I suppose, and was sort of all about like flouting like social taboos and so on. And I think it's interesting because, you know, it was like even in the 19th century, like they were seen as maybe particularly too racist or something like that. I mean, even though obviously like racism is kind of shot through with in the 19th century Britain, but nonetheless, their own brand of racism was maybe a bit too much, and perhaps it was partly, I guess, because of um, their heterodoxy, I suppose, like their willingness to critique Christianity and critique missionaries and things like that.
Okay,
And
interesting.
I think,
So,
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
just to add quickly, I think it's sort of a similar case for the American story that
Mm,
Josiah Nott, who is an important figure in the American School of Anthropology, is also sort of a free thinker. Um, yeah, a heterodox thinker. I don't, maybe atheist is too far, but
okay,
definitely like someone who's not Christian and sort of a skeptic of Christianity.
okay.
So I think that's a similar kind of drive there in the US as well.
Okay, so let's talk about biology and evolution, and of course, the main figure and the main work here is Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. So I guess the obvious question, based on what you've already said, is was Darwin a racist?
That's a difficult question. Um, I am going to try and sidestep the question and say that
Did he have like certain racist assumptions about other people
yes,
groups?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, definitely that's the case. I mean, I think sort of a general theme of my book is like complexity and kind of like gray areas and so on. And I think like Darwin is a case of that where, you know, on the one hand, he is someone who like he really hates slavery. He's very much opposed to slavery, and he's very much opposed to like violent imperial conquest,
Hmm.
and opposed to definitely to polygenesis and the ways in which it sort of drove those things and drove negative views of yeah, like other races. So that's the one hand. But then on the other hand, definitely, yeah, like you say, like definitely Darwin had what we might today say is like racist views of non-white people.
Hmm.
He definitely used arguments about so-called savage, like in quotes,
Hmm.
savage people, and almost to use them as kind of a bridge in his evolutionary theories. So
Okay.
the question is, I mean, one of the big difficulties, I suppose, for evolution is how to kind of jump from, say, primates up to humans.
Hmm.
And for Darwin, there were these like sort of so-called savage races, which were um, which in Africa or in the Americas or in Australia or things like this, who had, say, very basic language and very basic civilizations. You know, maybe they were just hunter gatherers or something like that, or
Hmm.
they had very simple social structures and so on. Um, and even like I think maybe Huxley, Thomas Huxley, one of
Hmm.
Darwin's disciples, I guess, and one of
His bulldog, right?
yes,
Yeah.
right, yes, one of his, yeah, is his like his promoter and so on. Kind of also made like sort of biological arguments that again, like there was it wasn't a sharp break, I suppose, between uh, the higher apes and humanity, but there
Mm.
was kind of a gradations, I suppose, like from these apes to sort of with so-called savage races in the middle, and then moving on up till eventually moving up to the the quote unquote like height of humanity, which is like Europeans.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think there's this. complexity, I suppose, in Darwin and evolutionary theory with regard to race.
Yeah, and I think also with his followers, right? You
Mm,
mentioned Thomas Henry Huxley, and Huxley was on average a bit more progressive in his thinking,
mm,
whereas physicist John Tyndall, who's also part of Darwin's group of supporters and advocates, he was actually quite racist. And I'm
mm.
working on the John Tyndall correspondence, and there are letters where
Okay.
Tyndall is actually quite open about his racism, whereas Huxley refuses to join Tyndall in his views, and you can see this in the
Mm,
correspondence. But
uh,
many people looked at Darwin's ideas and they sort of picked it up and transformed it into kind of a racist idea. So
mm.
how did they use his theory of evolution by natural selection to support these racist views?
Yeah, I think that's true that P Darwin's theories were kind of very flexible, that people could use them in all sorts of ways and to make all sorts of arguments. And definitely they could be put towards racist ends. One way to do that would be to say, um, such and such group is less evolved than white, say white people. Therefore, they're kind of an inferior group or an inferior society or something like that. Um, and therefore, we have the right to conquer them or whatever, or to treat people of that race like in a uh, mm, poor way. And also another thing to say is that kind of a polygenicist view of race could survive even within like a Darwinian framework.
Mm, mm,
And the way that that happens is um, by saying that particular races, yes, they're the products of evolution, but they sort of evolved from a separate like evolutionary line than
okay.
say white people did.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, to say like, perhaps the different races evolved from separate ape ancestors. So again, like it's a polygenesis in that they all have kind of separate evolutionary paths, even though like this evolution remains true, but the fact of kind of human unity is not retained in these theories, I suppose. Um, so that's yeah. So I mean, yeah. Another thing is eugenics, I guess, which is something maybe we'll touch on as well.
Yeah, well, I'll ask a question about eugenics in a moment, but I wanted to mention that you include many striking illustrations in the book, and one in particular that caught my eye is from the Truth Seeker magazine,
Uh,
and it's entitled "Parallel Cases," and this is on the whole idea of evolution. And it was published in 1890. We'll put up the image in the video, but the image shows a side by side comparison of a white priest driving away a comet and an African quote unquote savage banging on a drum as a way to drive away an eclipse. So the question is, how did atheists who were racist use evolutionary theory against religious groups, not just
yeah.
kind of racist ideas, but they used evolutionary theory against religion? For
Mhm.
example, you write that quote, along with accepting the idea that white European civilization represented the apex of progress, other white atheists gave a subversive reading of societal evolution, in which religion itself was seen as a product of evolution. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that's something that another way that Darwin's work is used in the 19th century is that people begin turning the theories of evolution like towards society itself and towards religion. So you see a number of theorists like Herbert Spencer and uh, I'm actually blanking on the name. Who's the famous uh, uh, theorist? I don't know. Do you know what I'm thinking of?
In America or in
No,
Britain?
in Britain. Oh, geez. I'm trying to think. He came up with the idea of survivals in um,
Taylor.
yes,
Yeah,
right.
Taylor, his early one of the founders of anthropology. Yeah,
Yes. And his
E.B. Taylor.
EB, right. Okay. Yes. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. But basically to say that religion itself is kind of an evolved feature, I guess, of human civilization. Um, and so the funny thing is of using, um, using so-called savage culture
Hmm.
and to draw comparisons to contemporary like Christian culture and to say like, how evolved actually is our own society when we still kind of believe in these superstitions that savages believe in. So it's an interesting thing because on its face, again, like the example of polygenesis, like the target is Christians. It's to attack
Hmm.
Christianity,
Interesting.
but it does kind of draw upon these racist ideas of that there are savage races who are inferior to our like
Hmm.
to white people. Um,
So they're looking at these people groups which are not very technologically advanced in their view, and they're calling them primitives or savages, and
yes,
then they're saying, "Hey, those Christians are the same way. They're like the savages. They're like the primitives." Is that what they're doing?
exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I think, and then they say, that, um, and it even becomes sometimes even more paradoxical than that because then they say like maybe actually these so-called savage groups are really the ones who are civilized and not
Yeah,
like
that's a flip side. Well, that's a flip side. I mean,
yeah,
in your book, you argue there's something of a kind of a shared experience among
mhm,
atheists and other minority groups in Europe
mhm,
and America. So, what was that shared experience?
yeah. I think it's of being uh, kind of an outsider to to power, I suppose, to political power. Um, I mean, I don't want to draw the point too strongly to make it seem as though white atheists are kind of one and the same with
Sure, sure.
colonized groups. But once in a while, you do see um, thinkers drawing direct comparisons and saying, we're just like the Maori or something like that. We can do so. This particular article, someone in Britain is lamenting the treatment of the Maori in New Zealand, and he's saying, well, like free thinkers and infidels like us, we're just as powerless as the Maori, like to sort of do anything about that.
Interesting. Yeah.
Um, so there was kind of, I think the thing is that they're in both cases they're sort of shut out from power, and they are again, not to draw the comparisons too strongly, but atheists in the 19th century were um, they were persecuted. I think is fair to say. I mean, like there were particular like legal ways in which they were um, uh, I don't know, maybe oppressed is too strong, but for example, about giving an oath in a courtroom, like without being able to, or sorry, giving evidence in a courtroom or something like that,
Hmm.
because atheists weren't trusted to swear oaths. They couldn't, they couldn't serve as witnesses in trials or things like this.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, and there were, um, people went to jail for blasphemy and things like this. And there was a social stigma around being an atheist. So for example, Annie Besant, who's another
Hmm.
secularist in the 19th century. So
Hmm.
when she and her husband split up, her husband got custody of their child, I think, or children, I'm not sure, but because of Annie Besant's non-religious views, that's why she lost custody of her
Yeah.
child or children. So I think like it's not like they were like hounded down for being atheists or something like this, but definitely they weren't. They were uh, um, they were not equal, certainly with Christians because of their religion. And a
Mhm.
further way is that often people involved in like the secularist movement um, came from the working classes. So again, that they're shut out, I suppose, from uh, kind of mainstream power. I suppose like
Yeah.
they see themselves kind of as outsiders looking uh, into their own society.
Okay. And we see this over and over again in your book, how in this historical narrative, how quickly some of these figures embraced the latest new discovery or the latest science and used it
Mm,
sort of as a weapon for their particular ideology, right? So some of the shared experience you're talking about here is the belief that these so-called savages or primitives, the colonized, were irreligious, and you bring this up,
mm,
and they were without religion, and I think
mm,
it's interesting because some of the historical actors in my own research who
mm,
admired things like Buddhism and other Eastern
mm,
traditions
mm,
because they believed it was nothing like Western religious thought. But
mm,
this was an assumption, right? And one that
mm,
was one that was usually wrong. They had, in fact, this kind of westernized conception or interpretation of Eastern traditions, and sometimes they intentionally simplified what is a very complex belief system. So
mm,
there were atheists simply looking for support for their own presuppositions, and they
yeah.
had already kind of made their own conclusions, so they wanted to
Mm.
find evidence to support those conclusions. So they look at these colonized people and they kind of assume that they were without religion. Do you see that
Mm.
happening as well?
Definitely, yeah. Um, yeah, I think again, like another kind of paradox is that in the 19th century, I guess maybe even into the 18th century, there were ideas, kind of good and bad, that some people said that so-called savages had no religion, but they meant it in a bad way. But then, like they were like so inferior that they didn't even have religion. But then you also see atheists uh, kind of drawing on these same ideas and saying, and again, the sort of class element is sort of important. They'll say, that this particular so-called savage group has kind of a very egalitarian social structure, and that's
Mm-hmm.
better than ours, and it's more just and so on. And it's because they don't have a religion that allows them to be much kinder and so on to each other. um yeah, and I think again, like it's true, like uh not just these so-called savage groups, but societies that were seen a bit like higher on the civilizational pyramid, like in China or India,
Mm-hmm.
were
Mm-hmm.
seen again, so far as it suited atheist arguments, that they were
Right.
actually like you mentioned, like Buddhism or in China like Confucianism, like these were actually atheistic, and they were more kind of secular worldviews than religion. And yeah, again, like you said, I mean, this was kind of simplistic, and it's
Mm-hmm.
meant to suit their own arguments, I suppose.
Yeah.
But yeah, but it's interesting in insofar as it kind of challenges maybe mainstream views at the time that said, these societies and peoples are just inferior to us. I mean, so yeah, that's
Yeah, it's that nuance again. You got the
mm,
positive, you got the negatives,
mm,
and so moving into the 20th century, into your conclusion in particular, which kind of really surprised me. You talk about how the Truth Seeker, the same
mm,
magazine I mentioned earlier,
right.
which was sort of the kind of a flagship magazine for American free thought in the second half of the 20th century, was taken over by white supremacists. And I
Yeah.
had no idea about that. And I was surprised, but
Mm,
in hindsight, after reading your narrative, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. And then you mentioned Richard Spencer, the
mm-hmm,
outspoken white supremacist who supported Donald Trump's
Mhm.
presidency, and
Mhm.
who also is, and again, I did not know this, he identifies himself
Right.
as an atheist, which I think is kind of wild.
Yeah.
So I think many people would find this remarkable considering how often conservatism and evangelicalism and racism
Mhm.
are mentioned in the same sentence by not just in the media, but also in
Right.
academics.
Yeah.
Um, so this kind of speaks, I think, in a way to the complex history of racism, science, and disbelief, but
Mhm.
also it says something about how our media simplifies everything in a way, in almost in a misleading way. How do we go about correcting these
Mm.
misperceptions? How do we
Mm.
add that additional complexity to our understanding
Mm.
of this history?
Yeah. That's a good point. I think I'm not sure like how to add, I think it's about kind of embracing the complexity and embracing that these stories aren't simple and that there's not necessarily, like good and bad good and bad teams or something like that, that there's a lot of gray areas and a lot of nuance and so on, and a lot of like paradoxical and surprising things, like and maybe even counterintuitive things. um and I think like that was kind of one of the interesting things, I guess, about writing the book, is how many surprising surprising things that came out. Like just to mention, like Charles Bradlaugh again, like I mentioned earlier, that he was sort of a supporter of polygenesis and drew upon racist ideas to make kind of anti-Christian arguments. But he was a champion of colonized peoples in the British Empire, and particularly India. And surprisingly, that like kind of an interesting tidbit that I found is that Gandhi, who was studying in London at the time of, just as a young law student,
Yeah, yeah,
he attended Bradlaugh's funeral because Bradlaugh was really admired by many Indians for his advocacy of India.
interesting. Yeah,
So I think like there's so many, yeah, like this like surprising cases that might run against our intuitions and things like
yeah.
this. And I think that's, yeah, I mean, that's like one thing that makes studying history really interesting, that you come across like these things. Yeah.
So we are asking all our guests how their work, their disciplinary or methodological approaches contributes to our understanding of, in this case, atheism, race, and civilization. So could you tell us a little bit about the approach you took in your book, and the sources you used in
Mhm.
researching the book? How do historical methods more broadly deepen our understanding of the history of racism?
Mhm. I that's when I was doing my PhD, I was at St. Andrews, and there was a very big contingent, I suppose, of intellectual historians there. And I think I was definitely inspired by this approach of viewing, or kind of putting emphasis on what authors were trying to do at the time, which sounds sort of obvious when you say it, but I suppose it's like it's trying to, I guess, to take historical figures on their own terms, trying to think about like what debates were important to them at the
It,
time.
it, it sounds obvious, but actually, a lot of people don't do
Yeah,
that.
yes, right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's yeah, I mean, to take, to not sort of come in with like with our own questions, but or our own kind of preconceived ideas of how these figures should kind of fit into the historical story, but kind of take them on their own terms, pay attention to what debates were important to them at the time, and um, what sort of terminology were they using and things like that. Um, that's not an issue necessarily in my in my own book, but it's sort of an issue in some other work to look at what concepts are being used and by historical figures. So I think that approach, um, yeah, definitely, I think is valuable in understanding atheism and racism.
Okay.
With regard sort of to my specific sources and methods, I was looking mostly at published sources,
Okay.
um, books and speeches, and particularly newspaper sources.
Okay. So a lot of archival research, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Oh, I didn't really go into things like correspondence and things. I mean, I think there's probably more work to be done in this particular area. Like you mentioned, like Tyndall's, like your work with
Hmm.
Tyndall's.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think I don't mention him at all. I don't think in the book.
Hmm.
Um, and I didn't know about that. Like you you mentioned about the what like what's coming out in his letter. So I mean, I think there would be more stuff that will come out. Like if yeah, if people look into some of these unpublished works and so on
Yeah. So
and
this
writing.
is this is a lesson for young historians or
Mhm.
undergraduates watching this video. Archival work is essential
Mhm.
for historical scholarship. That's something. Now, I mean, a lot of this stuff is now online
Mhm.
databases. You can look up newspapers from the 19th century, and that's very important. So, if
Mhm.
even if the archives are closed at the moment, as
Mhm.
they are, you
Mhm.
still have access. You still have a lot of
Mhm.
access to
Mhm.
some of these sources from the 19th century.
Yeah.
So, finally, what is next for you, like project wise? Are you working on a new article or another book?
Yeah.
What's something that we can look forward to?
I've got a number of different projects. The big, I mean, the one that I'm like most excited about these days is actually I've written a novel, which is like
Oh
completely,
yeah,
I mean,
sure.
non-academic, but basically the idea is it's sort of a it's sort of like Game of Thrones meets like the French Revolution.
Okay,
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
but actually, basically, it's relevant, I suppose, to my own my own book because in this sort of fictional society, one of the kind of the subplots is that there are these so-called sacred creatures, which are like unicorns and griffins
Hmm.
and so on,
Hmm.
that are in the society, and the whole kind of social religion is based around these creatures. And there's this idea that many centuries ago that a divine figure brought them down to the society. And so one of the subplots is about religious doubt and
Okay.
the origins of these creatures and so on. So I think I'm in the process, or I'm going to be in the process soon of looking for a literary agent, and then hopefully they'll, if I get an agent, then they'll try and find a publisher for the book. So hopefully that will, um, well, hopefully it'll be published, and hopefully people will be interested in it.
Okay. Oh,
Um,
you also have a podcast, right? And we'll actually include
yes. Okay.
that link in the video box below on the YouTube
Yeah.
page. So
Yeah.
what is your podcast about?
Yeah, so I've just started a podcast with my friend Todd Tavares. It's called the Beyond Atheism podcast,
Okay.
and the idea, we just had a couple episodes so far, but the idea is basically to um, many atheist podcasts sort of are just about making fun of religion or talking about like arguments about God's existence or so on. But I think with this one, we kind of wanted to talk about assuming the atheist position is true, like how do we kind of what do we do next, basically?
Mm,
Uh, yeah, so so it's sort of what do we do next, like in politics and in
okay.
society and so on. So it's meant to be kind of like an exploration that we don't necessarily have a clear end point. It's just sort of exploratory.
Okay.
So that's another project, and I've got one more that I can sort of plug
Sure.
if
Absolutely.
that's okay.
Absolutely.
Um, my I've done a bit of research on this particular for another book project, which is about the history of the word racism and just looking at the origins of the word and how its meaning shifts over time. Um, so it's meant to be a book, and we'll see if that ever gets concluded. But anyway, I've got an article that's sort of an offshoot from that project, which is coming out soon in the journal Patterns of Prejudice.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
this particular article is about the concept of prejudice, or racial prejudice, I should say, in the 19th century.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, we'll definitely include it, the link in our box when we publish
Right.
the video. But well, Nathan, thank you so much
Yeah.
for joining us today and for your contribution to the field. And we certainly look forward to whatever project comes up for you in the near future.
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.